In this video, I want to talk about some of the problems that we can have when we're trying to rely on volume-based cost drivers. We have looked at a lot of examples so far, and we've used volume-based cost drivers to allocate costs. So we've used things like direct labor hours, or we've used things like the number of units produced, or some measure of volume to allocate costs. And that works pretty well for a lot of cases. But one case where that starts to fall down is when you start introducing automation. So when things start becoming automated and we start replacing people with machines basically, and then our volume-based cost drivers don't really work as well, because for a long time before we had automation, we had machines that were producing products. A lot of companies had a company-wide cost driver, and a lot of times they just use direct labor hours to allocate all overhead costs, and that worked well because generally in that time overhead was pretty small relative to direct materials or direct labor. Those are really the two primary costs, and it was generally pretty highly correlative with direct labor hours actually. And they just used direct labor hour to allocate all overheads, just to make things simple. But once we've introduced automation and machines, labor hours didn't work as well, and you can see that in this example. So let's say this is a pre-automation of job 2. We have two jobs over here. We have job 1 and we have job 2. And job 1 uses two direct labor hours, and job 2 uses 6 direct labor hours. So in total we have 8 direct labor hours, and we need to allocate this $120 of overhead. So if you want to allocate based on direct labor hours, we just divide the 120 by 8, and we'd allocate $15 per labor hour. So for one job, we'd allocate 2 times 15 or $30. And for job 2, we'd allocate 6 times 15 or $90. So that's how we will allocate the 120. But look what happens if we decide to automate job 2. So we decide to automate job 2 and we end up replacing some of the workers with machines. So we go from 6 workers down to 1 worker, and our overhead also increases significantly. We go from 120 in overhead to 420 in overhead. So by automating job 2, we have decreased the amount of labor that we use. But we've increased the amount of overhead because now machines are producing the product instead of people. So if we decided to still allocate based on direct labor hours, we'd get some really strange allocations. And look what happens. Let's say we decide to allocate on labor hours. So we take this 420 and we divide it by 3 labor hours now, and you get 140 per labor hour. So for job 1, we'd allocate 2 times 140, which is 280. And for job 2, we would allocate 1 times 140, which is 140 again. But this doesn't really make sense anymore now that we have automated job 2, because look what happens. Job 1 stayed exactly the same, yet its overhead increased from 30 to 280. So it had a $250 increase in overhead. Yet there was no change. The only change was that there were no extra machines used in job 1, but there was an extra machine used in job 2. And you can also see, so this is $250 in the overhead now that we have allocated to job 1, really should have been allocated to job 2, because that's where the automation occurred. And so you can see how using a volume based measure like labor hours when we have automation doesn't make sense. So we need a different way to allocate this overhead. Doesn't make sense to allocate on labor hours if labor hours aren't driving the cost, and in this case they are not. Okay, this is another example where allocating based on a volume-based measure does not work very well. We've got two products over here. We've got vegetable soup and we've got tomato soup, and we've got the number of cans that we produce. So we produce 954,000 cans of vegetable soup and 234,000 cans of tomato soup. And our total number we produce in total was 1,188,000 cans of soup. We also have the number of setups. So when we change from producing vegetable soup to tomato soup, or vice versa, we incur some setup cost. And you can see that our setup cost is $264 per setup. So we have a 180 setups for vegetable soup and a 180 setups of tomato soup, so 360 setups total. So we're trying to figure out how do we allocate this setup cost. Well, the total setup cost that we got to allocate is going to be 360 setups times $264 per setup, and that's going to give us 95,040. So this is the overhead that we need to allocate, and we need to figure out a way to allocate this overhead to our vegetable soup and our tomato soup. So let's start with using a volume based measure. Let's try that first. Okay, so let's say that we want to use a volume based measure and we are going to allocate this overhead cost based on the number of units produced. So we've got overhead costs of 95,040, and we want to look at the number of units produced to the number of cans produced, which is 1,188,000. So we just take that overhead cost of 954,000 and divide it by 1,188,000, and you get 8 cents per can. So if you want to allocate this cost based on the number of units or the number of cans produced, our allocation rate is going to be 8 cents per can. And so for vegetable soup, we're going to multiply 8 cents times 954,000 cans produced, and that's going to give us 76,320. And for tomato soup, we're going to multiply 8 cents times 234,000 cans produced, and that's going to give us 18,720. Okay, hopefully you're seeing the problem with this. And the problem is that let's say we decided to eliminate vegetable soup right here. We decide that we don't no longer want to make vegetable soup. Would we eliminate $76,320 of cost as well? And the answer is no. If we were to eliminate vegetable soup, we'll only eliminate 180 setups. That's all we would eliminate if we eliminated vegetable soup. So how much would we actually eliminate in terms of cost? Well, 180 setups times 264 per setup, we would only eliminate 47,520 in the cost. So this 76,320 that we came up with when we allocated based on volume based measure like units is not at all avoidable. We wouldn't avoid all that cost if we eliminated the vegetable soup line. The only amount that we would avoid is this 47,520, and that's what we would actually avoid. So our allocation methods giving us bad information. Allocating based on volume based measure in this case doesn't work really well. So what we can do to fix this problem is that we can use an activity based allocation method. So an allocation is based on some kind of activity and not necessarily the volume of units produced or labor hours used. But activity like number of setups, I mean, that makes more sense because that's what's really driving the cost over here. So the activity would be the setups. And we know the allocation rate for setups is just $264 per setup. You can also figure that out by taking the 95,040 overhead cost that we want to allocate divided by the number of setups, which is 360, and you're going to get the 264 per setup. So our allocation rate is 264. In each product, we had 180 setups. So allocation based on number of setups would be 47,520 to vegetable soup and 47,520 to tomato soup. So hopefully you can see that the allocation method, whether we use a volume-based measure or an activity-based measure like setups, it really makes a difference. And it can affect decision making. So for example, let's say we had an outside company come in and they were to offer to do all of our tomato soup setups of $40,000. If they were to come and say, we'll do all the setups for your tomato soup for 40,000. While we were to rely on this volume-based measure, we would have said, hey, it's only costing us 18,720 to do the setups for tomato soup. So we're not going to take your deal. Your $40,000 is way too expensive because we can actually do this for 18,720. So you could, we would have this exact estimation in that scenario. But that would be the wrong answer because this setup cost actually costs us more than 18,720. When we allocate based on an activity based measure like number of setups, you can see that the setup cost is actually 47,520. So in this case, if we use the activity based measure, we'd say, hey, $40,000 to do all our setups, that's a pretty good deal. We take you up on it and then we'll save $7,520 instead. So our allocation method really matters, and you can see as we use this activity based measure, this actually tells us our avoidable cost And that's the cost that we want to avoid if we decided to discontinue one of these products. Because if we decide to discontinue vegetable soup or tomato soup, we'd avoid 47,520 in cost. So this is an avoidable cost.